The sun cast a golden glow across the boardwalk as Eliza Morgan rushed toward the crowded beach, her worn canvas bag bouncing against her hip. She was already late for her friend S' birthday celebration when she spotted an elderly woman struggling, with several shopping bags teetering dangerously close to the edge of the curb. Without hesitation, Eliza abandoned her hurried pace and veered toward the woman, whose silver hair glinted in the afternoon light. Little did she know that this simple act of kindness would catapult her into the orbit of one of the most powerful men in the city, a man whose heart she would capture before the summer ended. "Let me help you with those," Eliza offered, reaching for the heaviest bags. The older woman, its eyes crinkled with gratitude, revealing a striking shade of blue that seemed oddly familiar. "Oh, you're too kind," the woman replied, her voice carrying the slight lilt of old money and refined upbringing. "My son usually accompanies me, but he is preparing for tomorrow's sailing competition. I insisted I could manage on my own, but perhaps I overestimated my abilities." She chuckled softly. As they crossed the street together, the woman introduced herself as Alexander Blackwood. The name tickled something in Eliza's memory. Hadn't she just seen it on a billboard? Or was it in the business section of the newspaper she skimmed that morning? "I am Eliza Morgan," she responded, adjusting her grip on the shopping bags. "Are you headed far? I can walk with you." Eleanor's smile widened. "Such a dear. I am just going to that little cafe on the corner. My driver should be waiting." Sure enough, a sleek black car with tinted windows idled by the curb. The uniformed driver jumped out when he spotted them, looking both relieved and apologetic. "Mrs. Blackwood, I am so sorry. I was told you exit through the south entrance." "No harm done, James. This lovely young woman came to my rescue." Eleanor turned to Eliza. "Would you join me for tea? I insist on thanking you properly." Before Eliza could formulate a response, her phone vibrated. The text from her friend read, "Beach party cancelled. Storm warning. Rain check?" "I suppose. I do have time for tea after all," Eliza said, feeling a strange flutter of excitement. "Thank you." As they settled at a corner table in the quaint cafe, Eleanor studied Eliza with curious eyes. "Tell me, do you sail, Miss Morgan?" Eliza nearly choked on her tea. "Me? No. I'm more of a solid ground kind of girl. Why do you ask?" "The regatta tomorrow. It's quite the event around here. My son is competing." Eleanor's eyes twinkled with mischief. "You should come, as my guest." Something about the way Eleanor issued the invitation suggested it was not merely polite conversation. There was intention behind it, as if she were setting invisible dominoes in a row, waiting for the perfect moment to tip the first one. "I wouldn't want to impose," Eliza began, but Eleanor waved away her concern. "Nonsense. It'll be the event of the season, and between us," she leaned forward conspiratorially, "my son could use a distraction. He's been far too consumed with work lately. All those lobbying contracts and political connections have made him forget how to live." She sighed dramatically. The conversation drifted to other topics, but by the time they parted ways, Eliza had somehow agreed to attend the regatta. Eleanor handed her an embossed invitation card with the Blackwood family crest. "Wear something blue," Eleanor called as her driver helped her into the car. "It's my son's lucky color." That night, Eliza found herself Googling Blackwood, but lobbying from her tiny apartment above the bookstore where she worked. The search results made her stomach drop. Alexander Blackwood, 35, CEO of Blackwood Strategic Consulting, one of the most influential lobbying firms in the country. His net worth was estimated at over $500 million, and tomorrow she was supposed to watch him sail at his mother's invitation. "What have I gotten myself into?" she whispered to her reflection as she held up her only blue dress. A simple sundress she'd bought on sale last summer. It would have to do. As she drifted off to sleep, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would change everything. She just didn't know how right she was. The marina buzzed with excitement as Eliza navigated through crowds of spectators dressed in nautical-themed outfits that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Her blue sundress suddenly felt woefully inadequate, but she squared her shoulders and clutched the invitation card like a talisman. The security guard at the VIP section barely glanced at it before stepping aside with a respectful nod. "Ms. Morgan!" Eleanor S. voice rose above the ambient chatter. She sat beneath a striped awning, surrounded by people who exuded wealth and privilege. "I was beginning to worry you wouldn't come." Eliza smiled nervously as Eleanor introduced her to a dizzying array of people whose names she immediately forgot. One woman with a pearl necklace that could pay off Eliza's student loans raised an eyebrow when Eleanor mentioned they met while shopping. "Eleanor is always collecting strays," the woman remarked with a thin smile, and Eliza felt her cheeks burn. "I prefer to think of it as recognizing diamonds in the rough," Eleanor replied smoothly, linking her arm through Eliza's. "Now, let me show you where Alexander will be sailing. He in the blue and white boat, of course." As Eleanor guided her toward the water's edge, Eliza caught glimpses of the competitors preparing their vessels. They all looked like they belonged on magazine covers, tanned, confident, exuding the easy assurance that came with never having to worry about money. "There he is," Eleanor said, pointing toward a tall figure adjusting the rigging on a sleek sailboat. Eliza's breath caught. Even from a distance, Alexander Blackwood commanded attention. His movements were precise, economical, his focus absolute. The breeze ruffled his dark hair as he worked, oblivious to the admiring glances from women nearby. "He looks intense," Eliza observed. Eleanor chuckled. "That is one word for it. Stubborn is another. Brilliant when he wants to be, but he has forgotten how to enjoy life." She squeezed Eliza's arm. "That's where you come in." Eliza turned to her, alarmed. "Me? What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing sinister, dear. I just have a feeling about you. Mother's intuition, you might say." Before Eliza could press for clarification, a horn blared, signaling the competitors to take their positions. Alexander climbed into his boat with the grace of someone who done it 1,000 times before. As if sensing their gaze, he looked up suddenly, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on his mother, and by extension Eliza. For a breathless moment their eyes locked. His were the same striking blue as Eleanor's, and they widened fractionally in surprise at seeing a stranger beside his mother. Eliza felt a jolt of electricity run through her, rooting her to the spot. The corner of his mouth quirked up in what might have been a smile before he returned his attention to the task at hand. "Well," Eleanor said with satisfaction, "that is certainly a start." The race was exhilarating even to Eliza's untrained eye. Alexander's skill was evident as he navigated the course, his boat slicing through the water with precision. When he crossed the finish line in first place, the crowd erupted in cheers. Eleanor squeezed Eliza's hand excitedly. "He'll be insufferable now," she laughed, "but we love him anyway." The celebration afterward was held at a beachfront club that looked like it belonged in a movie. Eliza sipped champagne and tried to blend into the background, as Alexander was congratulated by what seemed like every person in attendance. She was contemplating a discreet exit when Eleanor appeared at her side, pulling her son along. "Alexander, darling, I want you to meet the lovely young woman who rescued me yesterday. This is Eliza Morgan." Alexander's eyes registered surprise, then interest. Up close, he was even more striking, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that belonged on billboards. His handshake was firm, his palms slightly calloused from the sailing ropes. "So you are my mother-ass knight in shining armor," he said, his voice deep and rich. "Apparently I owe you my gratitude. She tells me you saved her from certain peril." Eliza laughed despite herself. "Hardly, I just helped with some shopping bags. Your mother exaggerates." "I never exaggerate," Eleanor protested. "I was moments away from disaster." "Now who's being dramatic?" Alexander raised an eyebrow at his mother, then turned back to Eliza. "Still, thank you for looking after her. She is supposed to call for assistance rather than trying to manage on her own." "I am not an invalid, Alexander," Eleanor huffed. "No, just stubborn beyond reason." He smiled fondly at his mother before addressing Eliza again. "Do you sail, Miss Morgan? Please call me Eliza, and no, today was my first time even watching a sailing competition." "And what did you think?" "It was—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Freeing. You looked like you belonged out there, like you and the water understood each other." Something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps at her unconventional description. "That is exactly how it feels," he said quietly. Eleanor beamed between them. "Alexander, why don't you show Eliza around? I need to speak with the Andersons about their charity gala." Before either could protest, she was gone, leaving them in an awkward silence. "Your mother is quite the force of nature," Eliza finally said. Alexander laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his face. "You have no idea. I suspect I am being manipulated, and I further suspect you are an unwitting accomplice." "What do you mean?" "My mother has been on a mission to, as she puts it, bring joy back into my life, which translates to introducing me to every eligible woman in a 100-mile radius." Eliza felt her cheeks warm. "Oh, I should probably—" "No, please stay," he said quickly. "Glad for once her meddling isn't entirely unwelcome." He offered his arm with mock formality. "Shall we take that tour? I promise to return you safely to civilization afterward." Against her better judgment, Eliza found herself accepting. As they strolled along the marina, Alexander gradually relaxed, his corporate persona giving way to glimpses of the man beneath. He pointed out different boats, explaining their features with infectious enthusiasm. When she asked questions, he answered without condescension, seeming pleased by her genuine interest. "You don't belong in this world, do you?" he asked suddenly as they paused to watch the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. "Is it that obvious?" She grimaced. "It is refreshing," he corrected. "Everyone here is playing a role, myself included most of the time. But you authentic." Their eyes met, and for a moment the background noise faded away. Then a group of boisterous young men stumbled past, breaking the spell. "I should go," Eliza said, suddenly aware of how out of place she truly was. "Thank you for the tour, and congratulations on your win." Alexander looked like he wanted to say something more, but instead nodded. "Can I call you a car?" "No need. I can get an Uber. At least let me walk you to the exit." As they reached the parking lot, Alexander hesitated. "Eliza, would you—" He stopped, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "Yes?" she prompted. "Would you consider having dinner with me tomorrow night?" The question hung between them, laden with possibilities and complications. Every rational part of Eliza's brain screamed that this was a terrible idea. They lived in different worlds. Whatever he saw in her would quickly fade when faced with reality. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. His smile could have lit up the darkening sky. "I'll pick you up at 7. As her Uber pulled away, Eliza couldn't help but wonder if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, or perhaps its most serendipitous decision. The bookstore SS bell jingled as the last customer of the day departed, leaving Eliza alone with her thoughts and the comforting smell of paper and binding glue. She glanced at her watch. 5:30 p.m. 90 minutes until Alexander Blackwood, sailing champion, lobbying tycoon, and certified member of society's upper echelon, would arrive to take her to dinner. "Ma, you out of your mind," she muttered to herself as she locked the register and began shutting down the store. Her co-worker, Tina, had nearly fainted when Eliza mentioned her date. The Alexander Blackwood? The one whose face was on Fortune magazine last month? The one who whispers in senators' ears and makes markets move with a phone call? Tina had clutched Eliza's arm so tightly it left marks. How did you even meet him? The truth, that his mother had essentially engineered their meeting, seemed too bizarre to explain, so Eliza had simply shrugged and said, "Sailing competition." Now, as she hurried up to her apartment to prepare, the reality of the situation hit her with full force. What did one wear to dine with a man who probably had breakfast with governors and lunch with CEOs? Her closet offered limited options, none of which screamed worthy of a millionaire's attention. After trying on and discarding nearly everything she owned, Eliza settled on a simple black dress that hugged her curves without being too revealing. Paired with her one good pair of heels and the silver earrings her grandmother had given her, it would have to do. At precisely 7 p.m., her buzzer rang. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the intercom. "I'll be right down." She expected a driver, maybe a sleek town car waiting at the curb. Instead, Alexander Blackwood himself stood on the sidewalk beside. A vintage Aston Martin, looking like he'd stepped out of a James Bond film in a tailored navy suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. Several passers-by had stopped to admire either the car or the man. Eliza couldn't blame them for either. "You look beautiful," he said simply when she emerged, his eyes taking in every detail of her appearance with evident appreciation. "Thank you," she managed, suddenly self-conscious. "Your car is... wow." He smiled, opening the passenger door for her. "It was my father's. One of the few things of his I actually wanted to keep." The interior smelled of expensive leather and subtle cologne. As Alexander slid into the driver's seat beside her, Eliza was acutely aware of how surreal this moment was, like she'd somehow slipped into an alternate universe where bookstore clerks went on dates with millionaire lobbyists. "I hope you like Italian," he said as they pulled into traffic. "There's a place on the waterfront that makes pasta that would make actual Italians weep with joy." "Sounds perfect," she replied, though she suspected her neighborhood pizza joint's definition of Italian differed significantly from his. The restaurant turned out to be a small, unassuming building with no sign, the kind of exclusive establishment that didn't need to advertise. Inside, however, was a warm, intimate space with only a dozen tables, each positioned to offer a spectacular view of the harbor. The maitre d' greeted Alexander by name and led them to a corner, table set with crystal and fine china. "Mr. Blackwood, always a pleasure. Your usual wine." "Let us see what Ms. Morgan prefers," Alexander replied, turning to Eliza. "Red or white?" Painfully aware of her limited wine knowledge, Eliza smiled. "I trust your judgment." Once, they were settled with menus and a bottle of wine that probably cost more than her weekly salary. Alexander regarded her with curiosity. "So, Eliza Morgan, tell me about yourself, beyond rescuing elderly ladies and attending sailing competitions." "There is not much to tell," she admitted. "I manage a bookstore. I have a degree in English literature that's mainly collecting dust. I live in an apartment above the shop. My life is ordinary." "I doubt anything about you is ordinary," he said, his blue eyes intent on hers. "What is your favorite book?" The question sparked a conversation that flowed effortlessly through dinner. Eliza discovered that beneath the polished exterior of Alexander Blackwood, lobbyist extraordinaire, was a man with a sharp mind and unexpected depth. He'd read extensively, had strong opinions about literature, and listened to her perspectives with genuine interest. When she mentioned that her dream was to one day open her own bookstore cafe, he didn't dismiss it as fanciful, but asked thoughtful questions about her business plan. "Why lobbying?" she asked as they shared a tiramisu. "Of all the things someone with your advantages could do." Alexander's expression grew more serious. "My father built the firm from nothing. It was his life's work, and when he died, it fell to me. I was 25, barely out of law school." He traced the rim of his wine glass. "I never actually chose it. It chose me." "Do you enjoy it?" He considered her question carefully. "Parts of it. I enjoy the strategy, the chess game of politics. But lately," he shook his head, "let us just say my mother isn't entirely wrong about me needing to remember how to live." The vulnerability in his admission caught Eliza off guard. This wasn't in the calculating power broker she expected, but a man carrying expectations that sometimes weighed heavily. "Is that why you sail?" she asked softly. "To remember?" His eyes met hers, surprised and appreciative. "Yes, exactly. That on the water there is only the wind, the waves, and the next decision. No compromises, no negotiations, just clarity." The evening stretched pleasantly as they talked about everything and nothing. Their childhoods, his privileged but lonely, hers modest but warm. Their favorite travel destinations. He'd been everywhere. She had a list of places she hoped to visit someday. Their guilty pleasures, action movies for him, romance novels for her. When the restaurant began to empty, Alexander reluctantly signaled for the check. "I've monopolized your entire evening," he said. "I've enjoyed every minute," Eliza replied honestly. The drive back to her apartment was companionable. The city lights reflecting off the car's polished surface as they wound through streets that gradually became less affluent. When they reached her building, decidedly shabby compared to where they had just dined, Alexander parked and came around to open her door. "Thank you for tonight," she said as they stood on the sidewalk. "It was unexpected." "In a good way, I hope?" "In the best way." Yeah, he stepped closer, his height making her tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "Eliza," he said quietly, "I know our worlds are very different, but I'd like to see you again." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Why?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Why?" "Yes, why me? You could have anyone." Alexander's gaze softened. "Because with you, I'm not Alexander Blackwood, CEO or lobbyist or whatever title people want to assign. I'm just Alexander, and that hasn't happened in a very long time." He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away. Instead, Eliza rose on her tiptoes to meet him halfway. The kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. When she responded, threading her fingers through his hair, it deepened into something that made her knees weak and her pulse race. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "Is that reason enough?" Eliza couldn't help but laugh. "It needs a start." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I have meetings all day tomorrow, but are you free the day after? I thought we could take the boat out, if you're willing to trust me with your seafaring safety." The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. "I can swim very well," she admitted. "I want to let anything happen to you," he promised, his expression so earnest that she believed him. "Then yes, I'd love to." After another kiss that left her dizzy, Alexander reluctantly departed, the Aston Martin's engine purring into the night. Eliza watched until the taillights disappeared around a corner, then pressed her fingers to her lips, still warm from his. "This can't be real," she whispered to the empty street. But the memory of his touch, the lingering scent of his cologne on her dress, and the plans for a day on his sailboat suggested otherwise. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a fairy tale, one that would surely end when the clock struck midnight. But for now, she would allow herself to dream. The next morning, a massive bouquet of blue hydrangeas arrived at the bookstore with a simple note, "Thank you for an unforgettable evening." Okay, spill everything, Tina demanded as Eliza arranged the flowers on the counter. And Don, leave out a single detail. Eliza tried to downplay the evening, but her flushed cheeks and the flowers spoke volumes. Throughout the day, she found herself checking her phone for texts from Alexander, each one making her heart flutter like a teenager with her first crush. Just escaped a mind-numbing meeting about regulatory compliance. Save me. My mother called to, casually, ask how our dinner went. I suspect she has wedding venues on standby. What are you reading right now? Their exchanges were light, playful, revealing a side of Alexander that seemed at odds with his public persona. When he sent a selfie from his office, tie loosened, hair slightly mussed, looking exhausted but grinning. With the caption, "Thinking of you makes these endless meetings bearable," Eliza felt something shift inside her. This wasn't to just attraction. It was the dangerous beginning of something deeper. The following morning dawned clear and perfect for sailing. Alexander picked her up in a more casual vehicle, a Range Rover that looked like it had actually seen off-road use, dressed in shorts and a navy polo that made his tan more pronounced. Eliza had opted for white capris and a turquoise top, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. "You look like you belong on a yacht," he approved, helping her into the car. "I watched 3 YouTube videos about sailing fashion," she confessed, making him laugh. The marina was quieter on a weekday, with only a few boats heading out. Alexander's vessel, sleek, white, with blue accents, waited at a private dock. "And the LEB," Eliza read from the stern. "Named after my mother," he explained. "She's the one who taught me to sail, believe it or not. My father was always too busy." As they prepared to cast off, Alexander walked her through basic sailing terminology and safety procedures, his hands gentle but confident as he showed her how to put on a life vest. "Just in case," he winked, detecting her nervousness. Once they were on open water with the coastline receding behind them, Eliza felt a sense of freedom she'd never experienced before. The wind whipped through her hair as Alexander expertly maneuvered the boat, calling out instructions when he needed her help, his smile widening at her enthusiastic if somewhat clumsy assistance. You're natural," he encouraged when she managed to adjust a line correctly. "I am a disaster," she laughed, nearly losing her balance as the boat tilted. Alexander caught her easily, his arms strong around her waist. "I've got you," he said, and the words felt weighted with meaning beyond the immediate moment. They anchored in a secluded cove for lunch, an elaborate picnic he'd arranged, complete with champagne and strawberries. As they sat on the deck, the gentle rocking of the boat beneath them, Eliza found herself opening up about things she rarely discussed. Her parents' early divorce, her struggle to find her place in the world, her love of books as an escape. "Sometimes I think that's why I love the bookstore so much," she admitted. "Each book is a different world I can step into whenever this one feels too complicated." Alexander listened intently, his fingers intertwined with hers. "And what about this world right now?" he asked. "Too complicated?" She squeezed his hand. Terrifyingly so, but in the best possible way. His kiss tasted of champagne and possibility. They spent the afternoon exploring the coastline, Alexander pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of sailing adventures from his youth. When dark clouds began gathering on the horizon, he reluctantly turned the boat back toward the marina. "Perfect timing," he said, as they secured the vessel just as the first raindrops fell. Though I wouldn't have minded being stranded out there with you a bit longer." They made a dash for the car, laughing as the sky opened up above them. By the time they reached the vehicle, they were both soaked, hair plastered to their faces. "No, I've never seen anyone look so beautiful dripping wet," Alexander said, his eyes darkening as he took in her appearance. The temperature in the car seemed to rise several degrees. "Your place or mine?" he asked, his voice husky. "Mine is closer," Eliza replied, surprised by her own boldness. The drive to her apartment was charged with anticipation. They barely made it through her door before his mouth was on hers, hungry and insistent. Clothing created a damp trail from the entryway to her bedroom as they discovered each other with increasing urgency. Afterward, tangled in her sheets, Alexander traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "I need to tell you something," he said, his expression suddenly serious. Eliza's stomach clenched with anxiety. "What is it?" "I have to go to Washington tomorrow. A critical vote is coming up, and I need to be there for last-minute lobbying." Relief flooded through her. "Oh, how long will you be gone?" "A week, maybe more." He pulled her closer. "I hate the timing. I feel like I just found you, and now—" "I am not going anywhere," she assured him, though a small voice in her head wondered if this was where the fairy tale began to unravel. Once back in his world of power and influence, would he remember the bookstore girl who helped his mother with shopping bags? "I want you to come with me," he said suddenly. Eliza blinked in surprise. "To Washington? But what would I do while you were working? Explore museums, read in cafes, be there when I finish for the day?" He brushed his lips against her temple. I'm not ready to say goodbye yet." The invitation was tempting, a glimpse into his world, a chance to extend their time together, but reality intruded. "I can to just leave the store. We're short-staffed as it is." Disappointment flickered across his face, quickly replaced by understanding. "Of course I wasn't thinking." He kissed her softly. "We'll figure something out. Technology is wonderful. Video calls, texts. I'll bombard you with political gossip. Promise?" "Cross my heart." They spent the evening cooking pasta in her tiny kitchen, drinking wine from mismatched glasses, talking and laughing as if they'd known each other for years instead of days. When Alexander finally left, reluctantly, with multiple goodbye kisses at the door, Eliza felt his absence like a physical ache. True to his word, he called her from the airport the next morning, sent her photos of his hotel room with commentary about the pretentious decor, and texted her throughout the day with updates on his meetings. Each night they video called, sometimes talking for hours about everything and nothing, but as the days passed, his messages grew shorter, the calls briefer. "Sorry, emergency strategy session," or "need to prepare for tomorrow's testimony." Eliza told herself it was normal, that he was just busy, that she shouldn't expect to be his priority when he was working. Then came the photo. A society columnist had snapped Alexander at a fundraising gala, his arm around a stunning blonde in a designer gown. The caption read, "Lobbying powerhouse Alexander Blackwood with actress Jessica Wells at Senator Mitchell's re-election fundraiser." Eliza stared at the image on her phone, a cold knot forming in her stomach. They looked perfect together, both beautiful, polished, belonging to the same world. When Alexander called that night, she found herself unable to mention the photo, afraid of seeming jealous or insecure. Instead, she listened to him talk about the frustrations of dealing with stubborn legislators, offering supportive comments while wondering if the woman in the photo had attended these same events, if they had history together, if Eliza was merely a temporary diversion. "You seem distant," Alexander finally said. "Is everything okay?" "Just tired," she lied. "Busy day at the store." He accepted her explanation, but the call ended earlier than usual. Eliza curled up in bed, clutching her phone and wondering if she'd been a fool to believe that. Someone like Alexander Blackwood could genuinely care for someone like her. Their worlds were too different, the gap between them too wide. The next day brought no messages from Alexander at all. Eliza threw herself into work, reorganizing an entire section of the bookstore and taking inventory that could have waited weeks. When closing time came, she lingered, avoiding her empty apartment and the memories it now held. The store's bell jingled, and she looked up with a forced smile that froze on her face. Eleanor Blackwood stood in the doorway, elegant as ever in a linen suit, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. "I thought I might find you here," she said, approaching the counter. "Alexander mentioned where you worked." Eliza swallowed hard. "Mrs. Blackwood, this is unexpected. Eleanor, please." She glanced around the store with genuine interest. "What a charming place. No wonder you love it." "Can I help you with something?" Eliza asked, unable to discern the purpose of this visit. Eleanor's blue eyes, so like her son's, focused on Eliza with unsettling intensity. "I saw the photo of Alexander with Jessica Wells. I imagine you did too." Eliza's cheeks burned. "It is none of my business who he—" "They dated briefly last year," Eleanor interrupted. "It ended badly. She's been trying to reconcile since. That photo was her doing, not his." Hope flickered in Eliza's chest, quickly doused by practicality. "Mrs. Blackwood, Eleanor, I appreciate what you are trying to do, but the reality is that your son and we live in different worlds." "Do you care for him?" Eleanor asked bluntly. The question caught Eliza off guard. Yes, more than I should, given how little time we've known each other." "Then fight for him." Eleanor placed a book on the counter, a first edition of Pride and Prejudice. "I believe you know something about characters from different worlds finding their way to each other." Before Eliza could respond, the shop door opened again. Alexander stood there, looking travel-worn and slightly rumpled, his eyes finding hers immediately. "Und mother," he said, not taking his gaze from Eliza, "I should have known you'd interfere." "Someone had to," Eleanor replied crisply. "You were making a mess of things." She patted his cheek as she passed him. "Don T. botch it this time." When the door closed behind her, silence filled the bookstore. Alexander took a tentative step forward. "I came straight from the airport. I needed to see you." "What about your meetings?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I delegated them. Turns out I am not the only competent person at my firm." He moved closer, stopping when the counter still separated them. "I saw the photo with Jessica. It wasn't what it looked like." "I know." At his surprised look, she added, "Your mother just told me." But Alexander ran a hand through his hair. "Of course she did." He took a deep breath. "Eliza, these past days made me realize something. My life before you was efficient, successful by conventional standards. But it wasn't full. It wasn't vibrant." His eyes held hers, vulnerable and sincere. "I don't want to go back to that. I want complicated. I want real. I want you." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. "Oh, what about our differences? Your world, my world. We all build our own," he said simply. "Together, if that is what you want too." She came around the counter, closing the distance between them. "Is that even possible?" Alexander cupped her face in his hands. "Oh, I don't know, but I want to find out. With you." As their lips met, Eliza felt the last of her doubts dissolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever adjustments they would need to make, the connection between them was worth fighting for, worth believing in. Outside the bookstore windows, Eleanor Blackwood watched with satisfaction before sliding into her waiting car. Sometimes the best lobbying happened outside of Washington. 6 months later, Eliza stood in the grand ballroom of the Blackwood estate, trying not to fidget in her designer gown as clusters of Washington's elite mingled around her. The charity gala, raising funds for literacy programs in underserved communities, had been her idea, but Alexander and Eleanor had transformed it into the social event of the season. Politicians, business magnates, and celebrities filled the opulently decorated space, their jewelry worth more than Eliza had earned in her lifetime. "You look like you re-plotting an escape route," a familiar voice murmured in her ear. Alexander slipped an arm around her waist, resplendent in his tuxedo. "Are you okay?" Eliza leaned into his solid presence. "Just wondering if I'd ever feel like I belong in this world." "You don't have to," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Oh, that is what makes you extraordinary." Their relationship had defied expectations, both their own and society. Yes. The gossip columns had initially been unkind. Powerful lobbyist Alexander Blackwood, latest fling, bookstore clerk catches millionaire, SI. Eleanor had been furious at the coverage, but Eliza had simply shrugged it off. "Let them talk," she told Alexander. "We know what's real." What was real was the way they built a life that bridged their different worlds. Alexander had scaled back his Washington commitments, delegating more to his capable team. Eliza still managed the bookstore, refusing Alexander's offers to buy it for her. "I want to earn it myself," but had accepted his help in developing a business plan for her future cafe. They settled into a pattern. Weekdays in the city, where Eliza worked at the store and Alexander ran his firm. Weekends at his coastal home, where they sailed and read and discovered each other anew. It wasn't always smooth. They had arguments about money, about privilege, about the sometimes dubious ethics of lobbying. But they talked through each issue, learning and growing together. "There you are." Eleanor appeared beside them, elegant in midnight blue. "Eliza, the Secretary of Education, is dying to meet you. She's fascinated by your ideas for community literacy programs." Before Eliza could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. Jessica Wells had arrived, draped in a gown that left little to the imagination. Her gaze locked immediately on Alexander, a predatory smile curving her lips. "Wonderful," Alexander muttered. "Who invited her?" "Senator Mitchell, I imagine," Eleanor said tightly. "Shall I run interference?" "No need." Alexander's arm tightened around Eliza. "We can handle it." As if on cue, Jessica glided toward them, champagne flute in hand. "Alexander, darling, it's been ages." "Jessica," he acknowledged coolly, "you remember Eliza?" Jessica's gaze flicked dismissively over Eliza. "Vaguely. Still playing at shopkeeper, dear." Eliza felt Alexander tense, but she squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Not playing, Jessica, running a successful business. But I understand the confusion. The concept of actual work must seem foreign to you." Eleanor coughed to hide a laugh. Jessica's perfect features arranged themselves into a sneer. How quaint. Alexander always did have a weakness for charity cases. She leaned closer to him, lowering her voice to a stage whisper. "When you tire of slumming it, you know where to find me." Something cold settled in Eliza's chest. It wasn't the first time she defaced such comments, but they still stung. Before she could respond, Alexander stepped forward, his expression hardening. "That is enough, Jessica. Eliza isn't a passing phase or a charity case. She's the woman I love, the woman I am going to marry, in fact." A hush fell over their immediate vicinity. Eleanor's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Jessica's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. And Eliza felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Alexander," she whispered, uncertain if she heard correctly. He turned to her, his expression softening, seemingly oblivious to the growing audience. "This isn't it how I plan to do this," he said, taking her hands in his. "I have a whole evening arranged for next week. Sailboat, sunset, the works." You were serious." Eliza could barely breathe. In answer, Alexander reached into his pocket and dropped to one knee, right there, in the middle of the charity gala. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom as he opened a small velvet box to reveal a stunning sapphire ring surrounded by diamonds. Eliza Morgan, you walked into my life when I'd forgotten how to truly live. You challenged me, inspired me, and showed me what matters most. Every day with you is an adventure I never want to end. His voice was steady, his blue eyes fixed on hers. Will you marry me? The room disappeared. The curious onlookers, the shocked Jessica, even the beaming Eleanor. There was only Alexander looking up at her with such love and hope that it made her heart ache. Yes, she said, her voice breaking on the word. Yes, of course I will. Cheers erupted as Alexander slid the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, a kiss that promised a lifetime together. When they finally broke apart, Eliza was laughing and crying simultaneously. Well, Eleanor said, wiping a tear from her own eye, I believe this calls for a toast. She signaled to a waiter who began distributing champagne flutes. Though I must say, son, your timing is characteristically dramatic. Alexander grinned, keeping Eliza tucked against his side. I learned from the best, mother. And as congratulations poured in from all directions, even from some who had previously snubbed Eliza, she caught sight of Jessica slipping away, her perfect evening ruined. But Eliza felt no triumph, only a strange sympathy. Jessica, for all her beauty and connections, would never know the kind of love she had found with Alexander. Later that night, as they stood on the terrace overlooking the Blackwood estate's manicured gardens, Alexander wrapped his arms around Eliza from behind. Any regrets about saying yes in front of half of Washington? He murmured against her hair. She turned in his embrace, the sapphire catching the moonlight. None whatsoever, though I'm a little sorry to miss out on that romantic sailboat proposal you mentioned. Who says you have to miss it? He smiled down at her. I believe, in being thorough, you'll get your sunset proposal too. Consider tonight a preview. Eliza laughed, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. Aren't I love you, Alexander Blackwood, even when you'd impossible. Especially when I am impossible, he corrected, drawing her closer. And I love you, future Mrs. Blackwood, more than I'll ever know. As they swayed gently under the stars, Eliza marveled at the journey that had brought them here. From a chance encounter with an elderly woman struggling with shopping bags to this moment of perfect happiness. Different worlds could collide in the most beautiful ways, it seemed, when you were brave enough to cross the divide. Epilogue. 1 year later, a small sailboat cut through the sparkling waters of the Mediterranean, its white sail billowing in the afternoon breeze. At the helm, Alexander adjusted their course with practiced ease, while Eliza sat nearby, reading aloud from a dog-eared paperback. Their honeymoon, delayed for months due to their busy schedules, had taken them along the Italian coast, a perfect blend of adventure and relaxation. Away from Washington politics and social expectations, they had rediscovered the simple joy of being together without distractions. I think this is it, Alexander said, nodding toward a secluded cove ahead, the place Eleanor mentioned. Eliza set down her book, shading her eyes against the sun. It's beautiful. They anchored in the clear turquoise water and swam to the small private beach. Eliza had become a confident swimmer over the past year, no longer requiring Alexander. With constant vigilance in the water, she spread their picnic blanket on the warm sand while he uncorked a bottle of local wine. To us, he proposed, handing her a glass. 1 year of engagement, 2 months of marriage, and a lifetime to go. Adieu to us, she echoed, clinking her glass against his, and to your mother, without whom we never would have met. Alexander laughed. She reminds me of that fact regularly. He stretched out beside her on the blanket. Speaking of Eleanor, she called this morning while you were showering. The bookstore cafe's renovations are right on schedule. A day Eliza's dream was becoming reality. The space next door to her original bookstore had become available, and with Alexander's support, but notably not his money, she had insisted on securing her own business loan. She was expanding into a full bookstore cafe. Eleanor had unexpectedly taken a keen interest in the project, offering design advice that proved surprisingly practical. She also wanted to know if we'd given any more thought to her grandchildren question. Alexander added casually, though his eyes watched Eliza carefully. The weekly grandchildren inquiry. Eliza smiled, setting down her wine glass. Actually, I have been thinking about it. Quite a bit. Alexander sat up, suddenly alert. You have? She took his hand, placing it gently on a still flat stomach. In fact, I've been thinking we should start converting that guest room into a nursery when we get home. Say, in about 7 months? It took a moment for her meaning to register. When it did, Alexander's expression transformed from confusion to wonder to pure joy. Eliza, are you saying? I found out for certain yesterday morning, she confirmed, tears of happiness forming in her eyes. I wanted to wait for the perfect moment to tell you. Alexander gathered her into his arms, laughing and crying simultaneously. A baby, he whispered, as if testing the word. Having a baby. Undellen's going to be insufferable. Eliza giggled through her own tears. She'll claim full credit for orchestrating this too. Let her, Alexander said, his hand still protectively covering her stomach. She did bring us together, after all. As the Mediterranean sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they talked about the future, the cafe opening, the nursery plans, the kind of parents they hoped to be. Two people, from different worlds, creating a new one together. Later, as they sailed back toward their rented villa, Eliza watched Alexander at the helm, his profile etched against the sunset, and thought about the extraordinary chain of events that had led her here. A simple act of kindness toward an elderly woman struggling with shopping bags had changed her life completely. What are you thinking about? Alexander asked, catching her contemplative gaze. Just how unpredictable life is, she replied, moving to stand beside him. And how grateful I am that I decided to help your mother that day. He wrapped one arm around her, keeping the other on the wheel. The two best women in my life, conspiring to save me from myself. Is that what we did? Eliza teased. Save the mighty Alexander Blackwood? Absolutely. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. And I plan to spend the rest of my life thanking you both for it. As the coastline came into view, Eliza leaned against her husband's strong shoulder, content in the knowledge that sometimes fairy tales did come true, not with magic wands or glass slippers, but with open hearts and the courage to cross boundaries. Their story wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new chapter with many more adventures to come. The end.